You may have noticed, and frankly I hope that you have, that since my coming to Dunwoody, I have exercised great restraint. I have been here a little over 3 months. I have 2 grandchildren, and yet to the best of my recollection, I have not told a single grandparent story during worship. As I say, I have exercised great restraint. But a few weeks ago, something happened that I just have to tell you about. As some of you know, my daughter Catherine and her family lived near and worked in New York City. But in August, all of that changed. They moved to Raleigh, North Carolina. Both Catherine and her husband were following job opportunities. It was a good move. They welcomed it. However, their biggest concern was their 3-year-old son, our grandson, Max. Now, Max had only known one home, and so they knew that this move was going to involve some change for him. So wanting to try and help make that move as smooth as possible, they refrained from telling him for a while. But finally, the time came, and they called him into the den, and they explained in as positive a way as they knew how that they were going to move. Max asked a few questions, and they answered him as honestly and as openly as they could. And then he asked them when. Well, it was still a couple of weeks off, and so they tried to explain it in the language of a 3-year-old. They said, well, you know, Max, we have to pack up the house first, and you have to collect all of your things, and then we'll be ready to go. And after the conversation ended, Max went into his room, and he closed the door. And they wanted to give him a little bit of space because they thought, well, he probably needs to think through some of this somewhat. But they didn't want to give him too much space because they were also a little bit worried about what all of this would mean to him. And so after a few minutes of his being in his room with the door closed, they decided that they would go in and check on him. However, just as they were about to open the door, he opened the door and he came out. He had his backpack slung on his shoulder, and he said, I'm packed, when do we leave? Here in this section of Paul's letter to the Philippians, and as you know, we've been involved in a series of sermons on Paul's letter to the Philippians, but in this section from the letter of Philippians, in which we read in our first lesson this morning, Paul talks about the challenge of changing residences, not in the physical sense, of course, but in a much more significant way. He talks about the challenge of changing spiritual residences. It was a subject that Paul understood. You will remember that before Paul became the Apostle Paul, he was Saul of Tarsus, and his roots were deeply embedded in Judaism. In fact, Saul said that if he were to get into a bragging contest with others about whose roots went deeper into Judaism, that he would always win the contest every time, hands down. Why? Because he was born in the tribe of Benjamin, one of the smallest, but also one of the greatest of the 12 tribes of Israel. And like all good Jewish boys, he was circumcised on the 8th day. He received his religious training from one of the greatest rabbis in that day, Rabbi Gamaliel. And as to the law, he was a Pharisee, and you will recall that Pharisees were noted for dotting every I and crossing every T. And if all of that wasn't already enough, Saul was so deeply rooted in Judaism that he would defend it whatever it took. And he engaged in persecuting those who tried to challenge it. He was rooted in Judaism. Then came that day that changed everything. You remember while he was traveling to Damascus, he had an encounter with the living Christ who asked him, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? And out of that experience, Saul found a new spiritual home, one that was initially called the Way, but then later came to be called Christianity, one that was tied not so much to the traditions of the past as it was to a person, Jesus, whom Saul believed was the long-awaited Messiah, one that found its expression, not so much in obedience literally to a set of laws as to living by grace, and one that looked for ways not to exclude other people, but looked for ways to welcome and include other people into the faith, almost from the moment that Saul encountered Christ. The love and grace of Jesus Christ became his new spiritual home. So much so that you remember he even changed his name from Saul to Paul. Now, in real estate terms, Paul had closed on his new spiritual residence. But, and this is very important, but even though he had closed on his new spiritual residence, he had not yet entirely moved to it. As he suggests, and you have to read here to get this, but in verses 12 and 13 and 14, it's almost as if Paul says, listen, I've closed on the deal, but I haven't entirely moved yet. I know that one day I'm going to have all of my furniture in the new house just the way it's supposed to be, and all of my belongings will be unpacked, and I'll be able to sit on that couch with a glass of iced tea and just enjoy my new spiritual residence. But I'm not there yet. I'm still in transition. I'm still making the move. You see, Paul understood that changing residences, even spiritual residences, doesn't happen all at once. You may have decided that Christ is your spiritual home. You may have made the commitment to move to that new spiritual residence. You may even be in the process of making that move, but becoming like Christ, being transformed from who you are into who Christ wants you to be, being filled with love for God and love for other people, walking as Christ walked, having the mind of Christ in you. Paul knew that that is a lifelong process for all of us. In Wesleyan terms, we call it sanctification. Sanctification. And so all of these years later, when Paul writes to the Philippian Christians, he wants to try and help them understand this process. He wants to try and help them understand that this process involves a different way of living. He reminds them what anyone who has ever moved from one house to another house knows, that when you change residences, even spiritual residences, it involves letting go of some things. He reminds them that when it comes to changing spiritual residences, it may involve letting go of some things that have hampered your spiritual life. Maybe it's a destructive attitude. We're going to talk a little bit more about that next week. Maybe it's a destructive habit, something that's destroying your body, or something that's destroying your soul, or something that destroys your relationships with other people. Maybe it's a deep sense of sorrow that you just can't let go of. Maybe it's a failure over something, and you just can't put it behind you and move on. Maybe that's what you will need to let go of to make that move to your new spiritual residence. But maybe what you will have to let go of is not something that's hampering you, but rather something that you consider good, something that you have enjoyed, something that has been a blessing to you. I remember when Carol and I moved from our last house to the one that we're living in right now. There were some things that we owned. There were some things that over the years we had enjoyed, some things that had some good memories attached to them, some things that we appreciated. But we knew that they would not fit into the new house. And so, as good as they were, we had to let go of them. And that was Paul's situation. Paul counted his Hebrew heritage, his religious training, his time as a Pharisee. He counted the law all as good things, blessings, things of which he was proud, to the point to where he was willing to defend it and do anything to defend it. And that was the problem. Because Paul knew that he could not take that kind of national and cultural pride into the new house, the new home, the new spiritual home that was built out of love and grace. And so he had to let go of it. The other thing he wants the Philippians to understand about changing residences is that when it comes to changing spiritual residence, if you want your new spiritual home to be Christ, you've got to really want it. Again, as almost anybody knows who has ever moved from one house to another house, moving is not easy. Going through all of your belongings, and getting rid of the things that you're not going to take with you, that's hard, of course. We've talked about that. Then boxing up the things that you're going to take with you, putting them in the boxes, loading the boxes onto the truck, and then traveling to your new location, and then unloading the boxes off of the truck, and then trying to find the place where all of these things go in the new house, and then going out and buying new furniture for the house because it never quite fits exactly the same, and then trying to make new friends in your new location. It's not easy. Moving is not for the faint-hearted. And Paul knew that the same is true when it comes to changing spiritual residences. In fact, the word he uses here is the word straining. I'm straining forward, he said, to what lies ahead. You got to be willing to strain some if Christ is going to be your new spiritual home. Now, Christ will give you the grace to do it. He does not leave you to your own strength alone. Thank God. He's willing to come alongside of you with his grace to encourage you and to help you, just like a packing company sometimes does when they come in to help you make your move. He will do that. Christ will do that through his grace. But it's going to take some effort on your part as well. All that to say, Paul says that it's all worth it. In the end, it's all worth it. This weekend, Thursday evening, Friday, and then yesterday morning, I went to visit with my daughter and her family in their new home. They're almost unpacked. But at one point, we were sitting in the den of their home, and we were just kind of talking, and Catherine was reflecting on all of the work that had been involved. And at one point I said, "Honey, was it all worth it?" And she glanced around her den. She looked back over her shoulder into the kitchen, and then she looked over at her son, our grandson, sitting on the couch, enjoying his new digs. And she said, "Oh yeah, it was completely worth it." And Paul is saying here, even if it may not seem like it right now, even if all of the letting go and all of the straining forward, even if you can't see it right now, when you are unpacked and settled in the kingdom of God, it will all be worth it. Completely worth it. And that, my dear brothers and sisters, is the good news for this morning.